First of all, I would like to thank the Historic Brass Society Board for accepting this contribution that's being built from cultural history in order to contribute to the history of music and musical instruments in Mexico. This research finds as its starting point the last third of the 19th century, which, as will be explained, has characteristics of great interest for the history of music in Mexico in relation to the use and roots of certain musical instruments that contributed to the practice of various music, to the configuration of social networks around their consumption, to teaching, and to the proliferation of groups and solo instruments that, to date, continue to be extremely important in the country. As a precedent, the music and culture that has been documented to date has revealed that during the three viceregal centuries, the power and representativeness of Catholic Church in the musical sphere was unparalleled. In this context, the importance of vocal music, pipe organ music, or compositions for wind instruments such as bajones, bajoncillos, chirimías, sackbuts, and some string instruments stands out, and their uses are still being studied. In this context, it is worth highlighting the importance of pipe organs throughout the country, which are considered the most representative instruments of viceregal period and have been analyzed by specialists in their music and constructive qualities. From the 30s of the 19th century, the enthusiasm turned towards Italian opera, either through complete or fragmented performances, arias or transcriptions, and instrumental fantasies on motifs of operas, which were overwhelming in almost any concert. In those years, a growing market for instruments, music teachers, and home score music contributed to the participatory culture in which a professional community depended on its own financial means after centuries of church patronage. Then, one of the most relevant events was the birth of the association of some elite groups that resulted in the institutionalization of musical practices and the creation of spaces for entertainment and consumption. Theaters were built, and considerable performances of operas and zarzuelas were organized, as well as concerts. Artistic development centers were created that favored the participation of foreign and national interpreters. Instrumental ensembles and orchestras were formed. Specialized magazines were created and music teaching was strengthened. That institutional wave replicated cultural models of European countries such as France, England, and Spain, which were influenced by Romanticism and political liberalism. In fact, the names of these entities in the country were similar of those abroad. For example, philharmonic societies, lyceums, athenaeums, scientific, artistic, and literary circles, academies or societies of Santa Cecilia, national institutes, and conservatories, among others. These spaces coexisted with private saloons and social gatherings known as tertulias, in which, in addition to practicing music, identities were strengthened, coexistence was encouraged, and conversations were made on topics of interest. The public organization of concerts deserves special attention for the purposes of this research, since the musical activity that was born in those societies contributed to the creation of the first groups and orchestras in the continent. Those were formed by musicians and instruments available, with a predominance of wind instruments, which sometimes gave rise to a peculiar mixture of orchestra and brass bands whose functions were projected in different social spaces. However, The presentation of instrumental music, conceived as a public concert, was still weak. The possibility of listening to more or less complete orchestras was associated with the opera sessions. Chamber and orchestral groups were rare. Therefore, the role of brass bands was essential, since they were in charge of spreading a diverse and vast repertoire in Mexico and other countries. These bands, first military and then civil, served the acts, ceremonies, and political events. They led religious processions, participated in popular festivities, and gave open air concerts held in the squares and parks of the main towns, contributing to the recreation and enjoyment of the population. Countries of the American continent, such as Mexico, produced their instruments in an artisanal and manufacturing way, which was also characterized by being regional. They did not have the infrastructure of the experience or the experience to produce those industrial instruments so popular at the time, but they did have deep traditions and musical knowledge acquired through generations. However, a series of factors combined so that these objects gradually became part of the stages and collaborated in the formation of ensembles as well as emblematic spaces for the performance of music. As a contrary effect, instruments that in previous centuries were essential, such as pipe organs, sackbuts, chirimías, or bajones, fell into disuse, also its repertoire. From the end of the 18th century and throughout the 19th, Mexico incorporated instruments produced in other countries, especially pianos, but it was from the second half of the century that their introduction grew exceptionally. Especially during the first half of the century, political and economic imbalance and instability, banditry, the lack of congruence between legislative apparatus and the various ideologies, inefficient tax reforms, the poor state of transport, among other factors, gave us a consequence a vulnerable state in which little possibility of becoming a valuable territory for foreign investment and for the importation of certain goods, whether for daily consumption or luxury. But towards the period of the restored republic, once the government of President Benito Juarez and the liberals defeat Emperor Maximilian II and his conservative allies in 1867, and later with the ascent of Porfirio Diaz to the presidency in 1876, there was a relative equilibrium that accelerated the growth of the country and fostered, in various ways, new forms of expression. The Porfirian period sought to strengthen and consolidate the nation through modernization, which implied emulating certain cultural models from abroad, especially from France. The expansion of the state during the Diaz administration gave rise to a series of laws and institutional reforms, as well as the integration of the nation into the global capitalist economy. Likewise, a popular urban culture was created, which permeated regionally, built on particular patterns of consumption that were also manifested in musical life. For this reason, the idea of a modern state in which progress reigned, the development of new ways that promoted communications, the opening of markets, commercial activity, the consolidation of the music press, the creation of extensive networks with interpreters, academics, teachers, merchants, amateur musicians, among other actors, located on both sides of the Atlantic, were some of the most important factors that gave way to a new stage of exchanges in which new instruments were eagerly adopted to interpret the national or fashionable music. The typical music instruments of the military and civil brass bands that were manufactured since the second half of the 19th century in other countries, commonly used in Mexico, could be combined to form highly dynamic ensembles. They were easy to learn and fine tune, and their use did not distinguish professionals from beginners. In addition, these groups were true learning niches in the most remote communities who adopted or created music that gave them their own identity with their neighbors or beyond their countries, their territories. Despite the enormous importance of these instruments in the Mexican context, the country was not a prominent producer due to the complexity of such a specialized industry, the copyright of inventions, the lack of machinery to process the raw material, especially metal alloys, among other factors. However, various social and artistic groups were eager to integrate these products to promote their use. The arrival of industrial musical instruments in Mexico could be possible due to the profound economic and social reforms, especially towards the last 3 decades of the century, since they outlined a context that made their sale and distribution possible, which was combined with the high popularity of music as means of expression at any Mexican social level. The constant armed struggles, social movements, the search of the consolidation of the Mexican nation state and its integration to the rest of the world implied adjusting the economic models to the opening of international markets, creating new land sea routes of communication, and in the immediate social sphere, meet the growing demand of people for owning goods that were very popular in other countries. It should be noted that around 1870, the link between European manufacturers and music sale houses in Mexico took on a new impulse as a result of economic growth and the decrease in transportation costs, direct investments, the construction of the railway network, the dynamic complementarity that strengthened transatlantic trade links, as well as the modernization process that the Mexican economy was going through and must also be considered. In particular, it is known that the sale and distribution of instruments in Mexico were related to those of other types of products, such as scores, accessories, or instrumental methods, and that on many occasions the points of sale of these inputs were department stores, businesses specialized in music, or small local businesses that were in charge of distributing them to a wide audience, which is also an aspect that has not been studied in depth. Although it is true that philharmonic societies, conservatories, academies, orchestras, and venues were formed throughout the 19th century that consolidated musical education and the practices that were appropriate for it, it is known that it is not known what role the incorporation of those new instruments played. In other words, importation as a process for the entry of new products also had an impact on the formation of networks at different levels that allowed their access, that ensured their use, strengthened their consumption, and promoted their acceptance. The creation of spaces for this took place not only happened in exclusive areas of music, but also involved daily dynamics that had not been yet analyzed. From the above, some questions arise, such as what were the links that facilitated its access or allowed its sale in Mexico? In what context and where did the first musical instrument sales houses arise, and who made it possible for these to appear? Were there political figures who facilitated the creation of certain commercial networks? Therefore, the problem that this research will try to solve involves the recognition of social, political, and economic processes that, in more than 40 years covered by this study, made possible the incorporation of these instruments into the Mexican music environment, which implies identifying the social networks that made it possible, the economic and cultural context that sustained it, the civilizational program that was formed during the Porphyrian period, and the way in which those instruments were distributed in the country, which undoubtedly result in their supply in urban centers and remote regions. These suppliers, whether they sold sheet music, books, or instruments, were advertised in the almanacs and national directories with the greatest circulation, usually under the name of music repertoires, in order to distinguish themselves as specialist establishments. However, the wide variety of instruments that made up the most popular ensembles of the time could be sold elsewhere, such as hardware stores or merchant houses that also imported other objects from abroad. For this reason, almanacs and popular directories at the time will be reviewed to recognize what type of objects were sold and who headed those businesses. As has been mentioned, it is probably that elite groups that created the main philharmonic and teaching entities participated in the configuration of networks interested in the introduction of musical instruments to Mexico. Perhaps those actors were in direct contact with other spheres abroad, made up, for example, by manufacturers, intermediaries, traders, and markets that were beginning to look for spaces to sell their products. As mentioned, the instruments of manufacturers of enormous importance worldwide reached all Mexico. These builders use illustrated catalogs to publicize the qualities and costs of their products, and generally they distributed them through local intermediaries in purchasing countries. At the same time, these merchants claimed to be the legitimate distributors of those recognized brands, and through their own catalogs or advertisements, they made the merchandise known. Specifically, it is known that the renowned Wagner and Levine Company and this type of business relationship with the Gautreau factory in Paris toward the last third of the 19th century. So the comparative analysis of the catalogs of both companies will be of great relevance to know, in addition to the products, the models that were imitated to ensure the success of the sales. However, it is important to specify that these publications were not distributed to the general public, but to other businesses or other agents, so that in addition to being scarce, they were part of a specific sales strategy that will be analyzed in this research. Other manufacturers' catalogs located in countries such as Germany or Belgium have been digitized and made available to the public, so it will be relevant to know their content, the type of objects they traded, their costs and representativeness, in order to know if those instruments managed to be sold in Mexico and what spheres were interested in them. Finally, as has been pointed out in this project, the United States represented strong competition for European countries that sold musical supplies in Mexico, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Given the proximity of both countries and the low costs involved in importing objects by land, the sale of pianos, organ, and wind instruments, especially for bands, was increasing. Towards the first years of the 20th century, the United States had the primacy of sales of musical instruments in Mexico, and the sales and distribution models change. In the case of Mexico, those fundamental changes were gestated in the first years of the Mexican Revolution, from 1910 to 1917, that modified the social order. Porfirio Diaz was seen as a dictator who went against revolutionary ideas, and any cultural tradition related to Europe was suppressed in the face of new nationalist discourses. But music continued to be practiced, and instruments from abroad continued to feed musical ensembles everywhere in the country. Thank you.